Hey everyone, in this video we're going to take a look at chapter 37 of the Ecce Romani textbook and go over the chapter 37 grammar and some derivatives. So just like we always do, we'll start with the derivatives just so we can get some English words that come from these Latin vocab words. It'll help you to memorize the words, right, the Latin, as well as expanding your English vocabulary, right? It's always good to kind of pause and use Latin class as a way to get better at English. And by learning these derivatives, it'll really help you, like I said, expand your vocabulary and be able to not repeat yourself so often when you write or speak, and that's always a good thing. So we'll start with the derivatives, and then we'll head into the grammar, which in this chapter is deponent verbs. But like I said, to start, let's dive into some derivatives. So the first one I want to look at with you is castigare, right? From this word, we get castigate, castigation, and chastise. And this really does make sense because remember, castigare in Latin means to reprimand or scold someone, which is basically what all these English words mean too. Same idea. Next, we have utilis, right, which is a third declension adjective that just means useful, right? And from this, we get utilize, utility, utilization. They're all carrying the same meaning in English that the Latin has of being useful, right? So if you utilize something, you're using it. If you say, oh, it has a great utilization, it's a method of using it, right? So it all carries that same root, which comes from the Latin. Next, we have loqueris, which is one of the new verbs that we're going to see in this chapter. It's called a deponent verb. But this word, if you take it for a vocab word from the list, it just means you are speaking, right? You're talking. And this is where you get the word loquacious in English. If you call someone that, and it's not exactly a word you use a lot in sort of daily life, but still you might read it somewhere in a book, something like that. It means you're really talkative. If you call someone loquacious, it means they're always talking. So again, it's carrying that stem of talking. Next, we have Ingressi sunt, right? Now, this word again, these are all deponents. We'll talk about what that means. But this word means they went out, right? And this is where you get the word egress in English. It's kind of more, not necessarily old-fashioned, but maybe not something you normally use. But maybe in school, if you're doing a fire drill or something, they call it the egress route. It's because you're going out of something. That's exactly what it means in Latin too, right? They went out. Next, we have praefere. Now, this is a compound verb from the verb fere, which means to carry, right? And it's still carrying that same idea, except you have pri in front of it. Now, that prefix literally means before. So when you put these together, it's talking about carrying something in front of something else, right? And this is actually where we get the word prefer, too, right? If you prefer something, it means you kind of put it in front of or above other things. So it's related, right? Same root. It's a good derivative to know. Next, we have pedagogus, right, which is a tutor. And we've seen this word before, or variants of it. It's really talking about Euclides, right? You could describe Euclides as being the pedagogus for the boys, right, their tutor. But from this word in English, we get pedagogy and pedagogue, right? Pedagogy is one that you probably, maybe not probably, but you might have seen before. Pedagogy is talking about how we teach children, right? So when you talk about school, we talk about the pedagogy of it, right? So it has to do with this idea of teaching. I know it really means more like a tutor in this context, but again, the idea of teaching, it's actually a Greek stem. It means leading children, right? Teaching children. So that's really what it means. It's how you teach someone is really the idea. And next we have eruditus rather. And this means really learned, meaning you're scholarly, you've studied, right? And if you call something erudite in English or erudition, same thing. It means you've learned a lot, you're scholarly, you're very smart. That's kind of the idea. So it's coming from this same Latin root. And next we have ingressus est. Now, just like egressus, right? Egressus est means to go out. They went out. This is talking about going in. Right? So it's just the opposite. So instead of an egress route, you can talk about an ingress route. And it's the same thing. It's talking about going into something. Again, this is one of those words that you probably won't see a ton in day-to-day life, entering, but you might. And it's just, a good derivative to know, another alternative word in English for saying someone entered, right? You could technically talk about an egress or an ingress route. So that's all the derivatives for this chapter. But again, feel free to look through that list, and just anytime you can associate English words from these Latin vocab lists is always a win. So I like to do this for my students just so they can see it, and it makes the language a little bit easier for them. So hopefully it helps you too. So now we're going to dive into the grammar, which is deponent verbs. Now this is something really, it's not necessarily complicated once you get used to it. It's just tricky because it's not really something we do in English. And we're basically taking what you know about verbs and we're tweaking it a little bit and giving you a different type of verb, which can, throw some of my students off as we go. But still, if you practice it and follow along, pay attention, and read a lot, you'll be okay, right? The more you do with it, the better off you're going to be. So let's come back to Latin verbs, because again, we're talking about verbs here. What do we know about Latin verbs? Well, we've spoken about this a lot, but we know that they have three elements. They have tense, mood, and voice, right? That's really what we're after here. Now, in this chapter, when we talk about deponent verbs, we're kind of hitting on voice more than anything else, right? And it's not necessarily active and passive, but it's along those lines. So let's just think about the voice of a Latin verb. And remember, we said Latin verbs can be either active or passive. So in English, you could say, I see the dog, or you could say, the dog is seen by me. One is active, I, the subject, right, is actively doing something. I am actually seeing. In a passive sentence, the subject is not doing anything, something's happening to it. So when you say the dog is seen by me, the dog isn't doing anything. Really, I'm still the one seeing it. Something's happening to the dog, right? So you just want to make sure that you keep that clear, what we mean by active and passive, and it'll help you for this. Right? And they look different in Latin. And this is really the important part. You want to understand the English, but you want to be able to visualize it rather in Latin too. If you say canem video, right? I see the dog. But if you say canis a me videtur, the dog is seen by me. It looks different, right? You have video, I see, versus videtur, which means it is seen. Okay, so we're changing the verb endings. You might remember this, and hopefully you do. When we're dealing with passive voice, you have to change the verb endings around, right? There's a different ending for an active and passive voice verb. Okay, so why are we bringing this up? Well, there's a special type of verb in Latin that doesn't really follow these rules, right? The whole active versus passive thing. It's called a deponent verb. So deponent verbs, it comes from depono, deponere, which literally means to put aside or to lay aside. These are verbs that sometimes it said they put aside their active forms, which honestly to me doesn't mean a lot, right? And I'm not sure my students really understand what that means either, but that's okay. So we don't have to dive too much into the grammar of it, the kind of jargon aspect of it. But here's the main idea, and you want to write this down or just process it. They're passive in form, meaning they look passive. So they're going to be using passive verb endings, but they're active in meaning we translate them actively. And this is really where my students start to go off the rails, because what does that mean, right? How can you say that it looks passive, but we're translating actively? Like, what is actually going on here? Okay. And that's what we want to unpack, right? Why would the Romans do this? Why would they do this to me, right? If you're one of my students, you might feel like, why is Latin against me here? And this is where the language can get pretty tricky, which is why I try not to bog my students down too much in the grammar of it. I'd rather they practice it and see it in context. So that's what I would recommend you do too as we go through this video. But the general idea is that deponents are really leftovers of the middle voice, right? Which really died out in Latin. And again, don't get bogged down, but the middle voice kind of is this idea of, where deponents come from is kind of the idea. So if you want to look this up, let me put it like this. If you want to look up where deponent verbs come from, I'd highly recommend that you do. Have fun with it. Do a little research. You'll find it. You don't need to know that right now for what we're doing in Ecce Romani. It's good to know. I'd rather you don't get bogged down, right? Don't get bogged down in all that. All you want to know is the general definition. Deponents are passive verbs. They look passive, but we translate them actively. So they're sort of a hybrid between active and passive. That's all you really need to know. Okay. So like I just said, they have no passive translation, right? They're passive in form, but we're not translating them passively. So since they don't have a passive translation, they're missing that fourth principal part, right? Which is a perfect passive participle, because they can't be translated passively. So what would you do with a perfect passive participle? So because of this, they only have three pieces, which makes them really easy to spot in a dictionary. So if you're wondering, how am I going to recognize where the deponent verbs are or what they are? As long as you have access to a vocab list, right, which Ecce will always give you, or a dictionary nearby, which I highly recommend you have, right, just in case you get stuck. You'll always be able to tell where the deponent verbs are because they only have three pieces. So, for example, they look like this, right? We're used to seeing verbs with four principal parts. These all have three. And they're also using passive endings, which makes them really easy to spot. So instead of seeing in that first principal part a verb ending in O, we have OR, which is the present passive ending. And instead of ARE, which would be an active infinitive rather, we have ARE, which is its passive form. So conor, conare, conata, sum, right? There's only three pieces here, not four. They're using passive endings, right? Even conata sum, that third piece, is the perfect passive form, right? So they're all looking passive, but we're going to translate them actively, which is, again, the idea. But just for now, think about how you're going to spot them in a vocab list. You're looking for verbs that are using passive endings, which all of these are, and they only have three pieces. That's kind of the shortcut to figure it out. Okay, so although they seem pretty odd, right, it's something that's kind of jarring at first, you're going to be able to figure this out because you use them just like normal verbs, so non-deponent verbs. You just translate them actively, but otherwise the usage is exactly the same. So don't get thrown off. There's no special use. It's just this idea of they have a different way of translating them, right? They look different and we translate them slightly different than what you might think. Okay, other than that, it's the same idea. Okay, so let's look at an example. You have Euclides effugere conatus est, right? This means Euclides tried to escape. Conatus est is the deponent verb. And you look at it and you're like, wait a minute, Mr. C, I recognize that's a participle form, conatus, right? With the verb to be after it. And the verb to be is est, which is present tense. This should be perfect tense passive voice. And you're spot on. The form, right, is perfect tense passive voice. But because it's deponent, we're not going to translate it passively. We're going to translate it actively. So instead of saying someone was being tried, that doesn't even really make sense, do it actively. Tried. That's it. Tried is, we're translating it the same way as perfect tense active voice, right? So Euclides tried effugere, to run away, to escape. In the second sentence, we have praedones eam consecuti sunt. Right? Same idea, consecuti sunt. It looks like a perfect tense passive voice verb, which it is, the form, but we need to translate it actively. So you say they overtook him, not they were overtaken, right? They overtook him. In the third one, we have verior, right? Sed ad ludem ire verior. Now here, we have what looks like a present tense passive voice verb, which is true, except translated actively. So instead of I, am being afraid, right? Which really wouldn't make sense. You're going to say I am afraid. Active voice, okay? I'm afraid ire, to go ad ludem, to school. And lastly, we have semper loqueris, right? Loqueris, again, it looks like present tense passive voice, which it is, the form, but translated actively. You are talking, active translation, okay? So that's really the trick here. They look passive, but we translate them actively. So if you were to try to compare between deponent and non-deponent verbs, this is the general idea of how you can tell them apart. Non-deponent verbs, like regular verbs, they have active and passive voice, and they have different forms and translations for each. So in other words, you can spot an active and a passive voice verb because they're spelled differently, and you translate them differently, right? Active verbs, we translate actively. Passive, we translate passively. Pretty straightforward. And they have four principal parts. For deponent verbs, though, they have passive forms but active meanings, and they only have three principal parts. So one of them is missing. Right? So you can spot it because it looks passive, but we know it's going to be translated actively. So they're kind of similar, but there is a distinct difference here. Just something to keep in mind. Okay, so here's some important notes you want to think about when dealing with deponent verbs. So there are deponent verbs in all four conjugations. Okay, so it doesn't really matter. They follow the same rules. They use normal passive voice rules. So in other words, you can spot a deponent verb and put it into a conjugation. Be like, oh, it's first conjugation deponent, second, third, got it. So you want to keep that in mind because you have to use those rules for passive voice when you're dealing with deponent verbs. Okay, so same idea. You have laudator, he, she, it is praised, right? That's a non-deponent verb. It would be translated passively. But conator, which has the same ending, right, and it actually is the same vowel because they're both first conjugation, it's deponent. So conator means he, she, it tries. It's got the active translation. So again, there's the difference. Laudator is not deponent. Someone is praised. Conator is deponent. So we say someone tries, right? So this is a chart showing you what they look like for each conjugation. Okay, so down the left-hand side of this column, you can see first, second, third, third io, and fourth. And then we have the present, the infinitive, the perfect, and the English translation. Okay, so again, you have conor, conare, conatus, sum, to try. Down at the bottom, fourth conjugation, right? The infinitive is experire. The ire tells you it's fourth conjugation. For third and third io, the long I, right? Remember when we do an infinitive, a passive infinitive rather, we drop the ere and make it a long I. That's what they're using here. So in other words, if regredi were active, which it's not, you could almost expect it would be spelled regredere, right? Which is not a form, but that's the idea. That's why it has the long E there. And same thing, second conjugation, long eri, that's how you can spot it. So again, they exist in all four conjugations, 5 if you're including third io. So don't get thrown off. It's just you want to be able to recognize them and say, okay, this is passive, but I'm translating it actively. That's the idea. So if we keep going, here's another note. Okay, since they have no perfect passive participle, the third part of a deponent verb is actually what we call the perfect active participle, right? And this is what you're using for the perfect system, rather. So again, conatus sum, I tried, just translate it actively. That's really the idea. Next, you want to think about this. The perfect participle of a deponent will also, again, have passive form, but an active meaning. So the idea here is if you have that participial form without the verb to be on it, it's the same thing. You just translate it actively. So here, Ingressi, right? It looks like it should be a PPP, a perfect passive participle, right? But there is no passive translation, so it needs to be active in meaning. So when you say Ingressi, it means having gone out. It's an active translation. Remember, we learned about how that fourth principal part of a non-deponent verb, when it doesn't have the verb esse going with it, it's a perfect passive participle. But here we don't have passive, so it needs to be active. Okay, so that's why when you have pueri Ingressi, it means the boys having gone out, right? It's active. They are actually going out. Nothing's happening to them. That's how these work. So again, you can use these as participles too, deponent verbs, that is. No big deal. Just translate them actively and you'll be fine. Next, we want to think about deponent verbs and direct objects. They can still go with them, right? So there's nothing different here. You can use a deponent verb with a direct object, no problem. So if you said ille grammaticus me experitor, right? Experitor, test, is deponent, so it needs to be translated actively. So you're saying the grammaticus, right? Ille grammaticus, that teacher, tests, right? Experitor. Who does he test? Me. There's your direct object. So it's totally fine to put these with direct objects. Again, they function the same way as non-deponent verbs. They just have this weird quirk where their form is going to be passive, but their translation is going to be active, right? And I'll keep repeating it, but that's really the only trick. So this is a chart showing you all the deponent verbs, the conjugations, just to help you see it a little bit, okay? So again, the infinitives are going to have passive infinitives. So instead of ARE, long ERE, short ERE, and IRE, which are active, they have ARI, ERI, right? Long ERI. Then you get rid of what would have been a short ERE, active, and replace it with the long I, so loqui, right, for the third and third I. And fourth is long IRI. Okay, so just spot the infinitives right away. That's the trick, but you translate them actively. Okay, so conare still means to try, even though it has a passive form. Down you have the present, right? Same thing. You're going to the infinitive, you're dropping the RI, and you're adding your ending. So instead of OST must to sunt, you have RRISTUR, MUR, MINI, NTUR. That's what we learned for present tense passive voice. It's the same thing, which is why Ecce puts this chapter after you've learned passive voice. That way it's easier for you to do, and hopefully you remember it. Okay, so we're just using the passive endings. Same with imperfect. We use, instead of ba spot, it's bar spator, and down the line. And for future, instead of bo be boo for first and second, it's bor beris bitor, right? And for third and fourth, instead of the A and 5 E's, it's the R, right, on the ending. It's still A and 5 E's, but you have the RRISTUR as your endings, right? Instead of MST down the line, you're just using the passive endings. So again, what you learned for passive voice, you're applying here. You're just translating it actively. That's the only difference. And down for perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect, same idea. You're taking that participial form, you're sticking the verb to be on it. If the verb to be is present tense, it's perfect passive. If it's imperfect tense, right, arat, it's pluperfect passive. And if it's future perfect, it's aroarisarit, that's future, if it's future, for the verb to be aroarisarit, that's future perfect passive voice. But again, I keep saying passive because that's the form, but we're going to translate these actively. So conatus sum is going to be I tried, perfect tense. Conatus eram, pluperfect, will be I had tried. And conatus ero will be I will have tried. So again, the forms are passive. I'll repeat this again and again just so it sinks in. The forms are passive. The translation is active. So don't get freaked out by these. You do the exact same thing you already know. You should be fine. Just remember, you have to translate them actively. That's the only trick. Okay, this is a list of the deponents you've seen so far in Ecce Romani. And again, notice how they all have 3 parts and they're all using passive endings. So you have, again, to try, to delay, to fear, collapse, to speak is an important one, right? Loquor, sequor, to follow. These are all things you just want to be familiar with. You don't necessarily have to memorize them. You can if you want, but you're going to keep adding to these every chapter. So if you're trying to memorize deponent verbs, you might be doing a lot of memorization, which really isn't the most effective technique. I'd rather you use this in context. So as you read, look at a vocab list really quickly and say, oh, got it. Conor is deponent. That'll help me when I see it as conatus sum, right? It means I tried, not I am being tried. That doesn't really exist, right? So you want to just recognize that and do practice problems. Do practice problems. Read as much as you can. You'll be so much better off than just trying to memorize these, because you're going to get confused if you're just trying to memorize, okay? So let's look at some examples. If you said quid puellae facere conantur, right? Conantur is deponent. It's the verb to try. It's present tense, so we just translate it actively. What are the girls, the puellae, trying to do? Conantur facere. It's a complementary infinitive. So again, conantur, deponent verb, translated actively. In the second one, if you said, quando nos visitare conaberis, right? Conaberis is future tense. It's the verb to try, just normal future tense. So translated actively. When will you try, or rather, will you try to visit us? Nos, right? Conaberis is second person singular. When will you try? That's all, right? We're just translating actively. In this third example, you have polisper in urbe morati sumus, right? We remained. Morati, mora, it's the verb to delay, remain, right? Just translate it actively. It's perfect tense because you have that participial form going with the verb esse, in this case sumus, which is present tense. It's perfect tense, passive voice, but we translate it actively. We remained in the city, right? Here's another one. We have convivai quam celerime, ingressi inter se magno cum streptu and atrio collequebantur. Okay, it's a long sentence, but the key here is ingressi. That's the participle, right? Notice how it's a participle without the verb to be on it. So it looks passive. It looks like a perfect passive participle, but you're going to translate it actively because it's a deponent verb, ingredio, right? To enter. So you're saying the guest, the convivai, having entered, ingressi is still modifying or describing convivai, the dinner guest. Remember, convivai is masculine, even though it's a first declension noun. That's why we have ingressi with a long I. But it's just the guest having entered. Then you have a second deponent verb at the bottom, collequebantur. It's imperfect tense, translated actively. They were talking, rather. It's talking about the guest. They were talking. That's how you do this, okay? So you can do all these examples. The key idea is you're just taking deponent verbs. They look passive, but you need to translate them actively. And I've said that a million times. Hopefully it's sinking in. But the best way to do this is honestly going to be through practice. Now, here's my pro tip for you. Another good way to do this is to memorize it through song form. And again, I am not High Pause. I've never met this person. I'm just a big fan. High Pause, if you haven't been following them on YouTube, go find this, right, and give them a follow. Amazing videos, very quirky, very odd, all right, just to be honest with you. They're weird videos, but they do help you just understand what's happening with some quirky, weird songs. And again, anything like this you can see in song form, anything kind of goofy, it always helps you remember what's going on. So I'd highly recommend you go check out High Pause. He has a video on deponent verbs. Feel free to take a look at it, and he's going to sing to you in very sort of creepy, weird fashion what they are. That would be my pro tip. Bonus pro tip, again, I am not affiliated with Magustrula at all. I'm just a big fan, right? If you're not using Magustrula, or maybe your teacher hasn't shown this to you yet, go find it, magustrula.com. Very easy. You can do charts, sentences, whatever you need. If you do the charts, you can set it to give you deponent verbs, and it will, in all the tenses, right? And it'll just help you practice spitting these out. So you can say things like, I try, you try, he, she, it tries, and down the line. And you can repeat them over and over again until you feel really confident in how these deponents work. The second thing you can do, it's actually on the right-hand side here if you see under activities, you can hit sentences. This will let you organize and set up sentences. They can be simple, they can be difficult, you adjust it, but you can have it use deponent verbs, which is a really good way to get a lot of practice. I'd highly recommend you use that option, the sentence one, just to get as much translation practice and reading practice as you possibly can. That would be my tip. So again, High Pause, Magustrula, go for it. I think it would really help you. So let's just recap what we learned. Okay, and bring this video to a close. Deponent verbs, they're the new type of verb we're seeing here. They're a special type of Latin verb that has passive forms, meaning it's spelled with passive endings, but we translate it actively. It has active meanings. That's the key idea. They have 3 principal parts, not 4, so you can spot them a lot more easily in the dictionary, right? Because you're going to see a verb with passive endings and only 3 parts. There's your deponent verb. So look for those every time you start a new chapter of Ecce, or if you're just looking up a word in the dictionary, right? It'll help you understand it. They exist in all 4 conjugations. So first, second, third, third, and fourth, they all have deponent verbs. It's totally fine. Don't freak out about it. Just practice them. But knowing what conjugation your verb is in, your deponent verb, will help you remember the rules for how you conjugate them into, the different tenses, basically, right? And you're using passive voice conjugation, even though they are translated actively. And they have, they function just like non-deponent verbs. You can use them with participles. You can use them with direct objects. You can use them in a complementary infinitive. All these things we've learned, they function the same way. right? So it's not like they're anything different. They just are having passive forms and you translate them actively. That's the only difference. And again, the best way to learn these, I would say, is through practice. Practice as much as you possibly can. Use Magustrula, use your book, read. It's one thing to write down notes, which is great, but it's so much better if you actually practice this. So a site like Magustrula, I know it's not necessarily a story, and I enjoy the stories in Ecce too, right? It makes it a little easier, but it'll give you as much repetition as you could possibly want of just translating verbs, sentences rather. So I'd highly recommend you do that. Practice it. And again, every time you go through a new chapter of Ecce, look for the deponent verbs, right? That way you can kind of spark your memory and kind of give yourself a hint like, okay, I'm translating this actively. It's going to look passive, but I'll translate it actively. That's the key thing. Deponent verbs are all over the place in Latin. And again, when you first see them, it's a little jarring, but the more you practice, the more comfortable you're going to feel. Good luck with it. If you have any questions at all, feel free to put your question in the comments and I'll help however I can. But otherwise, keep practicing, keep reading, and good luck.